Hi there. This is John for killerphp.com. And right now what I'm going to be doing is looking at how we can take our current MVC application, and we've been doing some work with callbacks. We've been looking at how we can create various hooks into our application, and the only way that we've looked at it right now is to create what's called a callback, a function that is passed to another function and is run whenever it makes sense for that function to run inside of another object. So if we go back to the anatomy of our project here, we've got a function called getDefinitionListFunc. And what getDefinitionListFunc does is it doesn't actually run anything. It just returns a function that is ready to do something for us. And some people call this a lambda function. If you're familiar with the map function in some other programming languages, this will look very familiar to you, or closures in C. But basically what we're doing is returning a function. And that function is getting passed into another function called renderWidth. And renderWidth is part of an instance of the user object. So if I go to the user object and I look down here, I will see that there's actually a public function called renderWidth. And what renderWidth does is it runs this callback and it returns the value based on its own local instances of these variables. So now we're going to look at another way of dealing with this whole situation, which is also a very common practice when you want to decouple or separate out responsibilities into different smaller classes. And the observer pattern requires that you have two things. You have a subject and you have an observer. So the observer looks at something and it's looking at the subject. The idea is that you want to have a series of things subscribe, and these are the observers. The observers have to subscribe to a subject. And what that means is that if the subject does something, all the observers need to find out about it. So there's kind of this one-to-many relationship between observers and subjects. So in our case, the subject is going to be the model. It's going to be the user. The user is the subject. And the observer is going to be the controller. So the controller only does something once the subject tells it to do something. Now the subject doesn't know what the observer is going to do, but it's just going to kind of wave a flag and say, hey, I'm doing something. This will all be a little more clear once we actually get in the code. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at index controller, and you can see that it extends controller abstract. And controller abstract, if we go back to it, basically it implements something called iController, but it's also going to implement another interface now. And that interface is going to be, I'm just going to collapse these down. That other interface is going to be lib_observer. And we need to say what lib is, so I'm going to say use com killer php lib as lib. And this is going to bark and say what's lib observer, so we need to define that. So I'm going to go into my killer PHP folder and I'm going to create a new folder called lib. And this is not necessarily part of a controller or a model. It's just a generic class or a generic declaration for what an observer should be. So I'm going to create a new file here, and it's going to have a namespace of com killer php lib, and it'll be an interface called observer with a public function called update, and it will take an object called subject. So we're going to save that file. I'll save that file under killer PHP, com killer PHP lib, and it'll be subject.php. Oops, that'll be object observer.php. Sorry. Okay. one of them will be observer, one of them will be subject. So this will be subject. Actually, hold on. So let's open observer. Okay, so this is fine. Observer.php with an interface called observer. Now I'm going to do the same thing with subject.php. So if I go back and I look at subject, it's also going to be an interface, and it's going to be called subject. And it will have two functions. It'll have a public function called addObserver, and it'll take an observer object of type O, and another public function called removeObserver. Just like that. So if you think about this, the subject in our case is the model. The model can add or remove any observers, and the observer in our case is going to be a controller, and the controller is going to have to handle whenever the subject updates itself. This is often called publish and subscribe, because one object has to publish its changes, and the other object is subscribing to those changes. Another term that's often used is an event listener, where you have an event that happens, and you have people listening to that event. So these are all similar to what is called the observer pattern. So now that I have my subject and my object, or my subject and my observer defined, I now need to implement these interfaces in their respective classes. So we said that the index controller would be observing, and that the user model would be publishing out, or would be the subject of observation. With that being the case, we are going to say that we want to use com killer PHP lib, or rather, we don't even need to do that. We can just use our shortcut. And we'll say not only are we extending controller abstract, but we're also implementing kp/lib/observer. And part of that is identifying a public function. Like if I refresh this again, you'll see that I'm going to get an error. And it'll say class index controller contains one abstract method and must therefore be declared, which is observer update. So we need to define that. There we go. If I refresh this again, oh yes, we can't just use subject, because we're doing this whole thing in PHP 5.3 and getting ready for PHP 6. We have to be very specific about what kind of classes we're using. So in this case, it has to be kp/lib/subject. And there we go. So that's working. Let's implement these functions first and then get them working. So update can run at any point, and that's kind of the idea here, is that update is going to run, and when update runs, it's going to do something. So in our example here, now if I go to the user class, you'll see that it extends model abstract. And if I go to model abstract, if I go to model abstract and models, model abstract, I can actually say here that I want to implement, and I want to use com killer PHP lib as lib/subject, because everything that's a model in my application is going to be treated as the subject. And so now I'm going to have to define two more methods, one for addObserver and one for removeObserver. and we're going to have to maintain a list of observers as well. So we'll just make that an array. Now, adding an observer would be basically saying something like observer and then putting in the object. Now there's a problem with this. What if we accidentally subscribe or add or register the same observer twice? Now there's a very easy way of dealing with this problem. All we have to do is get the special object hash for that object. So every object in PHP will have a dynamically generated but consistently used ID. And so that's going to be determined using SPL_object hash. For remove observer, it's going to be something very similar. We're going to say ID equals SPL_object_hash, and then we will unset this observer's ID. And then we have to reset our array, so we'll say this observers equals array values this observer's ID. So this is all fine and dandy. We've implemented these two methods, but we're not actually doing with anything with our observers. And this is where things get a little more interesting. So we can add observation to anything, and that's really the responsibility of the object itself. And in order to keep this nice and simple, I'm going to create a public function, and this is basically what makes this whole system work. Actually, this can be protected. And it'll be called notify observers. And here for each this observer as O, we'll run O update on this. Now let's think about this for a second. If one of our observers is the index controller, then we're basically, if we run the function called notify observers inside the user model, then it will run the update function from the index controller and pass this object in, whatever this object might be. So we're pushing the concern or the responsibility of notification back into the controller's hands, but it's only happening when the model wants it to. Okay, so let's imagine for a moment that we wanted our notify observers function to be used when the user saved something. So the save parameters function in our example returns the keys that were set and so on and so forth. If we wanted to, we could notify the controller or any other class that's interested that the save has been committed. So instead of doing just a return keys set here, I could actually take the time and notify all my observers. And I could say this notify observers. If I go back to my index controller here with my empty update kp subject function, which we very quickly fleshed out, that's not doing anything. If I do a var dump, then we'll see what happens. Now, this function is only going to get called by the subject, which in this case is the user. And if I go to the default action here, we're going to see that save parameters happens over here. And rather than saying, key set is going to be equal and defined over here, we can actually move all of this functionality into the notification. So it looks a little something like this. For now, if I put in John and Leben sold and I hit submit query, let's see what happens. So we get an error on line 40 of model abstract. When you're adding your observer, you're going to want to be careful to make sure that observers is properly spelled. There we go. So you'll see that when I refresh this page, that my subject object is returning back with the saved parameters. And so now I've almost separated the function call from the result. So if I wanted to, I could actually just move this key set down here, or up here, and then rather than do the keys setting over here and the rendering function, I could actually move that into the update statement. And here I could, instead of doing key set, which isn't particularly interesting, I could say that, this new user equals, and it would be the subject object. And then if I go back to default.php, I can say that if is set this new user, we'll simply echo this new user. And we'll say, we have a new user, and like that. So if I go back here in my index controller on line 60, semicolon, very important, you'll see nothing. If I submit the query, we have a new user that lives at nowhere, but if I put in John Levensold and Canada, I submit the query, then we have a new user, John Levensold lives at Canada, and you can see that the update function is getting called, but it's actually being called by the model. So what's neat about this is that we could actually have our update function be different and our save do different things in different controllers. Well, this is just a good technique to know and to be familiar with when you're dealing with MVC and just frameworks in general. I hope you found this series interesting, and if you have any questions, don't be shy and post them on the Killer PHP forum, or you can email me. And I hope that this sort of advanced topic in PHP architecture was helpful, and I look forward to seeing all your wonderful responses. Thanks for listening. Bye.